Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us here tonight. My name is Krista, and I'm with Faber-Castell. And tonight we have Franz Spohn. Hi there, Franz.
Hello.
Franz lead us through an activity creating some Valentine's cards. So I will let Franz go ahead and lead the creative activity. But if you have any questions, feel free to post those in the chat, and I will answer for you. And if I don't know the answer, I'll break in and I'll ask Franz to field the question for you. So welcome. Sit back, enjoy, create with us, and have a nice time in the workshop. It's all yours, Franz.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. Valentine's Day has always been one of my favorites, and I think that it was established early in elementary school. I loved the idea of getting Valentines for everybody and making a box and then going into school. And when I went into school, you get treats, and we get little ice cream cups or ice cream treats that were heart-shaped and everything. And as a kid, it was one of the most, it was almost better than Christmas. Not quite, but it was pretty close to that. So I love the idea of Valentine's too, is that it's one of those opportunities you have to correspond with people and all that. And behind me, I don't know if you can really see them too well, I blew up some images of some older Valentines from the 30s, the 40s, and all that. And I kind of like rummaging around and looking to see different styles. And of course, I go to the stores today and kind of see what's available. But I think the best Valentines are the ones that you make yourself. And so I thought I would just kind of run through. I will make one, and then we'll talk about variations and maybe how you can change things. But the main thing that I want to do is just show you that you can really have a lot of fun making your own Valentine. And it could be a small Valentine, it could be a big Valentine. It should be, though, based on what you would like to do, what you think would be a fun thing to do, because there is certainly no right or wrong way to do this. There are all sorts of things. So I will show you a couple tricks and kind of, take you through my method of making them. And so I'm going to switch cameras to the overhead so that you can kind of see what is going on. Make sure that's turned on here. And that should do it. We'll see. There we go. Okay, this is an example that I made ahead of time. And it's, I know if you can see it from the side here, but it pops off a little bit. It pops off a little bit. The light's a little bit kind of odd in here, so it blinks off a little bit. But at any rate, so it's lifted a little bit to one side. It's almost like a pop-up. And so that I'll show you the mechanism for doing that. But if I kind of press down on it, it flattens down. So you could easily put this in an envelope and send it through the mail. And then when somebody opens it or takes it out of the envelope, then it would pop up. So I don't know if you can kind of see that action or not. So we'll move off this and get down to what we're going to do here. And what I have here is just a red piece of paper, and you can use just about any kind of paper that you want. This is some that I found at a Michael's store. It's 50 sheets, and what's important though, this is more like a card stock, or it's slightly heavier paper, but it's called acid free. And what's nice about if you use construction paper, that'll look good for a while, but then it has a tendency to tear apart and kind of deteriorate a little bit. And so if you're spending all this time making a Valentine, you want to make sure it's going to last. So the piece of paper I have here is about 14 inches by about 8 inches, I think. And you can go ahead and plan, again, you can make it as small as you want or as large as you want. But I'm going to flip this over, fold it in half, and this is what I'm going to start with. All right, now I have a white Faber-Castell brush pen, and what I'm going to do is kind of create an environment in the background first, and then I'm going to have, let me show this again to reference it. So I've done the background first, and then I have the Valentine, and then I put the pieces together. So we can either start with the Valentine or the background. Let's reverse what I just said there. Let's go right with making the Valentine. Okay, so I don't want to make it too much bigger than this because I want to be able to get some background space. So it's good to kind of keep that in mind. And I don't know if it shows up, but this is more of like a lighter orange. This is, I mean, red, I'm sorry. This is a different shade of red. And I kind of like using the two different reds. I know that, you know, when fashion people have a tendency to want to make sure your reds match. But in this case, I want there to be enough of a difference. And I'm going to use this corner point right here as the base of my heart. And then if you want a real simple way of making a heart that is a little bit more kind of exact, if you just draw a line that is perpendicular here, you know, so it comes straight across here, and then about, you know, look at that for a minute as a guide. Okay, and then I'm going to come down here. Okay, so I've got this point, and what I can do is, this is just like a roll of tape. You could get any kind of a round thing. You could use maybe even a soda can or something, but anything that's round. And so what I'm going to do is kind of line it up to where I just drew. And this is going to be the round part here. And then I'm going to come over and do the same thing here. I'm going to kind of draw around this way. And then I'm going to come across like this. And so then I'm going to have my heart. So you can use like a craft knife. You can use a pair of scissors, you know, whatever you want to start with. But now I just cut that out. Okay, I'll put that off to the side. And so I've got my heart here. Let's move this for a second. All right, so I got my heart. Now, I'm going to take another piece of white paper. And then I'm going to trace my heart. But I'm going to leave a little bit.
Had a hard time seeing the lines that you drew to make the heart. Could you maybe repeat that process on the white paper? It might be a little easier to see.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay, so what I've done, let's see, now I've thrown my ruler right here. I just get down. Okay, so maybe what I'll do is just kind of show you a little bit about, okay, so the heart's going to be something like this. All right. And so I'm going to take my roll of tape, and I can kind of go around it. Yep. And then put this one. And what I'm doing is taking this and lining this edge up against here, and then figuring out where it has to meet here. And I come around, and it's like that. Now, if I want to adjust it, you know, let's say I want to make it maybe a little, then I can adjust it a little bit more that way. And then I can cut that out. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so now, yeah, that's a little bit small for what I need here. So now what I'm going to do, all right, I'm going to put this, it's almost, okay, so I'm going to make it so that there's a little bit of a border all the way around. And so then I'm going to sketch around this way. Okay, so now I'll draw a little bit darker so you can see it. I don't know, I was afraid that if I put a light on, does that make it easier to see? That makes it worse, doesn't it? Okay. All right, so And you could just freehand it if you want. It doesn't have to be, you know, sometimes if you make them a little more eccentric, they may have a little more charm. But instead of using a regular pair of scissors, I found, you know, I just grabbed a set of pinking shears. And they have, let me let it go up. You can see that it gives you kind of an extra edge. And there are all sorts of scissors out there that have weird little edges to them, but I thought that would kind of be a nice way to add kind of a lacy effect. So now I'm going to just follow that line. And if you leave a little bit of the tracer line on, it's totally fine. Around. And then I'm going to go straight down here. Okay. So again, I'll put it up against a red background so it shows a little better. Okay, and so let's maybe if I zoom in a little bit, there we go. Okay, so now you can kind of see now, instead of having those lines showing, I can flip it over and then it looks nice and clean. And then I'll be able to put my heart on top of that. Now, oh, here it is right here. Okay. Okay, so let's zoom back up so you can kind of, okay. All right, now you can use paste, you can use double stick tape. There are all sorts of things that you can use in order to, I have this double stick tape. That'll probably be the fastest thing to use. And so I'm just going to very quickly tape this down just so that we save a little bit of time. Use my pinking shears actually. So I just want to stick it so it stays in place. And the way this tape happens, it works is once you put it down, then if you peel the paper off, then you have the adhesive. Of course, you gotta. Yeah, okay, so that comes off. But again, if you have paste, if you have glue, you know, whatever you have that is good for sticking things, that'll work. Okay, so now I'm going to position it. I'm going to hold it up a little bit until I have it exactly where I want it, and then I'll press it down. Okay, so now I've got my main heart and I've got the decorative edge around it. So now let's start playing with making the actual features of my heart. And I kind of like the idea of making it look more like a kind of a face instead of just leaving it plain. So that's what I do a lot of times. So I'll kind of very lightly, again, maybe if I zoom in just a tiny bit, you can kind of see a little better about what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm going to have some eyeballs here, perhaps, and then kind of a nice pointy nose. And since it's Valentine's Day and everybody's happy, kind of a smile and some nice cheeks. Okay, so this is going to be my basic notion here. Now, in order to make that kind of come out, what I can do now, I could, if I wanted to, I could cut some white paper out and paste it down on the eyeballs or the teeth or something like that. But as I started to mention, I have a Faber-Castell white Pitt pen. You could use a white pencil. You could use another color. Again, this is just what I'm doing. So you can decide for yourself. So what I'm going to do is start working on doing the features. Okay. Now it starts out to be fairly opaque, and then as it dries, the red paper comes through. It looks more pink than red. And then I'm going to kind of work on the top of the nose a little bit, and then I'm going to put some goofy teeth in here. And then think if the light is, let's say, kind of coming down and towards this direction, then I'd have a bit of a highlight kind of on that cheek about there, and I'd have it about here. Okay. Now, as that dries, it's going to get a little bit darker because the red is coming through. And so I'm going to take advantage of that. And so I'm going to start to kind of cover this up a little bit. And as I do that, I can take my finger and kind of rub it a little bit. So get rid of some of the smears. And this is going to make this look a little bit more like a pink. As I kind of come close to the eye, it's going to get a little bit darker. And over here, you know, I might kind of work with the cheeks a little bit. Okay, so. And come down here a little bit like that. Maybe underneath the lip. Maybe kind of up above here, a little bit there. Okay. Now, they also make a smaller tip. And so if I very lightly kind of strike that in there, then that's going to be even lighter. And so it's going to start to kind of blend together a little bit. Right. Now, with a pencil or another one of our Pitt pens or something, I can come back now and I can start working on some of the darker areas. So in through here, if I come back, and again, let's see if I can get a little bit closer to it. So we'll go the other direction. Okay. So I can start putting in some shadowy areas. So the bottom part of that nose will be a little bit darker. And again, with these Pitt pens, I can kind of, or if I wanted to, I could use a color pencil. Grab a color pencil here. I can do the same thing with a color pencil. I can start to put a little bit of tone in there and then go on top of that white area a little bit. So you can see the way it's kind of working it together and starting to get a little bit of dimension there. Okay, so let me back out again. Okay. So once this is dried, I'm going to come back and I'm going to give it another coat of white. So I'm building that white up. I'm kind of laying in the basis for what's going to be the brightest white and then work on the intermediate things. Okay, so now I'm going to start working out maybe some of the darker areas. I want to start getting things to start popping out. So the mouth, inside of the mouth is going to be a little darker. And so as I work on that, okay, that's going to make those teeth kind of pop out. And I'm going to put a little bit of shadow underneath that lip. And then let's start kind of putting the bottom of this in as well. Okay. And then take my pencil. I like working on a lot of materials at the same time. You know, the Pitt pens, the crayons, if you have watercolor, if you have regular crayons, it's just a matter of you to kind of start playing to see what works best. And so now what I'm going to do is start kind of putting in a little bit of darker tone in a couple places. Now over on this side, I want this to be, definitely darker because I want to go from the light to the dark. And so I'll make it the darkest around this area. And then as I come across here, I'll put a little less pressure on it. So it gets a little bit lighter and lighter because I want this part to be the lightest part and over here a little darker. Okay, now I'm going to take a brighter red and I'm going to start kind of working on blending that kind of white highlight into the background color a little bit. Same way up and through here. Just very lightly kind of going over there to start blending that together a little bit more. And again, the whiteness of down, I put down at first, once I put pencil on top of it and started to blend it. And it's going to make it look more like a highlight then. Okay. Now I want maybe part of the eye, so that's dried enough that I can put another layer of white down. And so that's going to make it a lot brighter. So I'm kind of keeping it on the right side. A couple more here. The teeth, make those maybe just a little brighter on the nose there. A little bit up here like that. Okay. Come in here. Okay. And then I want to kind of put a little bit of shading. I just not quite sure why this is so a little bit too bright in a way. It's kind of hard for you to see the true color, but it'll be. So I'm going to put that a little bit in the shadow. I'm going to make this a little bit more shadow in through here, this side of the teeth, that side of the teeth. And then I can kind of come back in through here and get some more shading and shadowing down. So this is kind of the process I do to try to kind of blend everything together. I want to get the nose to pop out a little bit. I kind of, want the mouth to go obviously a little bit farther back so it looks a little bit deeper. I can take another Pitt pen and, oops, point. Let's try this kind of dark blue. Come in. I don't want to go to a straight black because I think that would be a little bit harsh. Put a little bit of darker color in through there. Okay. So anyhow, the light is washing this out just a little bit. I don't know how I can adjust the light here. Maybe I can. Well, we'll keep on going. And at some point, maybe if I dim my main light, then you'll be able to see it better. But at least you can kind of get some kind of idea of, the basic thing. So here's my main character. So we'll start with that. Okay, so now this is the card. Now open up. And so I'm going to position my card, my main character about there. Okay, so what I'm going to do with a pencil, or actually to make it show up so you can see it, I'm going to just kind of I'm going to just outline it a little bit, because this is kind of where I was thinking I might put it. Okay, all right, so I don't know if you can see it, but it's right there. And so I'm going to kind of bury the tip a little bit. So I'm going to make a little cut right across there. Okay. So I have a utility knife. You could use a pair of scissors, something like that. But essentially what I'm going to do is just make a cut like that. And then poke it through. So that kind of anchors it. All right. So I can pick it up and down and whatnot. So, and then planning on taping it or gluing it down here. I'm going to wait until I get some of the background down to do that. But I want to make something that will keep this sticking up. You can see the way my hand is, and it's about maybe ½ an inch up, kind of like a springy thing. So I'm going to make what's called a paper spring. So what I will do is take a scrap piece of paper, and I'm going to cut 2 strips, and I'll move this out of the way so you can see a little bit more about what I'm doing. So about the same width, same, same length, and I'm going to take some paste. This is just regular kind of wheat paste. And I'll take a scrap piece of paper and put it underneath so I don't get it on my table, but I'm pasting that end. All right. Then I'm putting this, actually, let me get a piece of white paper so it shows up a little bit better. Okay. And so now I'm going to put another piece perpendicular to it. So it's going to make a nice squared angle there. Okay. Then I'm going to fold this piece over it. And then I'm going to fold this one over. And you press it down a little bit and over and over. And I'm going to keep on going until I think it's about as thick as I want it. Okay, so when I have pressure on it, it stays fairly flat, but then as soon as I let it go, it springs forward. So when I kind of get to the end of it, I'm going to take some more paste. I'm going to flip it over, and then I have a little spring clamp. Okay. Or you could use a rubber band, or you could use a weight or something. And then I can just clip it like that. Okay. He asks, can you turn that light down a little bit? I have my son, who's my lighting assistant. If we turn the light down a little bit, maybe, yeah, a little bit more, a little more. Ah, okay, that's perfect. All right, I think you'll be able to see things a little bit better that way. Let's see. Oh yeah, they're a lot more detailed this way. Okay, all right, so you want to wait this, you want to make sure that you wait to have it dry before you use it. And to save time, I already made another one up, and so I'll release it. And so as you see, when I unravel it, it expands out. And then when I compress it, it goes down. So I will use this. All right, so I'm going to have my key character go in here. All right, I'm going to glue this down, but then I'm going to put this spring down here. And so it kind of puts it up. I don't know, I'll lift it up and maybe you'll be able to see it a little bit better. Okay, so it's about 1 inch away from the background. So over the camera, you may not actually be able to see that that's like that. But it kind of gives it a nice slant. So it's almost like a slope that is going up around. Right, now this is when it really starts getting fun. I'm going to kind of leave it there just for now to give me an idea of where it needs to be. And then I'm going to go back with my white marker. And I'm going to start creating the background. And so I'm going to kind of think that this guy is kind of in a snowbank. And the reason I'm thinking about snow is that I'm in Michigan and it's about 9 degrees and we have quite a bit of snow out there. So I'm thinking of February as still being in the height of winter. All right, so I've kind of indicated where that's going to be. And maybe I'll just put one little dot here, just to give me an idea of where the parameters are for the heart. And I'm going to take that out because it's going to be a lot easier working on the background if I don't have that in the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of use my white marker here. And you can kind of see how it's much more transparent once you start trying to cover large area with, and that's exactly what I want. I want the red of the background to start coming through. And I'm just kind of laying out, okay, so we got one snowbank there. All right. And then we'll have another one maybe kind of coming over this way. And I like the idea of that. All right, so it's going to be, the light is going to be coming from this direction. So this part is going to be a little bit brighter as it comes up on the top. And then over here, it's going to be the brightest. So, you know, I will work on this now. Once it dries again, I can. Now I'm just lifting up a little bit. So I'm putting a little less down. Again, you can use your finger to kind of start blending that. But it starts giving you a feeling of where the light is. And I'm creating kind of these snow drifts. And then as I back off a little bit, so if this is going to be hill here, that's going to be hill here, it's going to be brighter there. And then as it kind of tucks into this one, it's going to get a little bit darker. So I'm going to want this one to be a little bit brighter up and through here. And I'm lifting up on the pressure a little bit, laying a little less down as I come around because I want it to start getting a little bit darker. So it starts to build up this kind of volume or this feeling of what's happening in through here. So I'm going to put a snowman here, kind of greeting his friend. And I'd already kind of marked approximately where the border is going to be here. So I don't want him to be covered. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to just kind of very quickly indicate where the snowman is going to be. And then, you know, carrot nose. And then the arms. And then maybe a scarf. It's blowing in the wind a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to do the same thing, that once I get that kind of blocked in, I'm going to think that the light, again, is coming from this direction. And so I want to make sure that it's, let me try to focus it a little more. Okay. And then maybe make these a little bit brighter where the white on the side of the head, a little bit on the top of the beak there. So I'm kind of priming the canvas here, so to speak. I'm kind of making it so that it's a little bit whiter. Okay. So now I'm going to take, say, a dark blue pen or a black pen, if I can put my hands on it here for just half a second. It's going to think about where the hat would go. And so I'm going to kind of draw where the cat needs to go. And so if I put a little band there, and I might want to come back and kind of cover that with a little bit of white too, because I want a color for the band. All right. So let's start kind of filling in details for the hat. Comes across like that. And then here's the eyeballs. Happy little guy. Okay. I can take, let's make him maybe have a green or maybe a blue scarf. So put some blue in here. Okay. And then I can start working on maybe his arms. Okay. Carrot nose. And I'm going to keep a little bit of white at the top as kind of a little highlight to help separate it from the background. And then maybe we'll have a matching band up here at the top for his brim. Okay, so I can take my white and kind of come back on top of that one more time and maybe make the top of his scarf a little bit brighter than the bottom part. Okay, so then let's put him back in here now and kind of keep him a little bit more in place. Tilt him off a little bit. So start finishing the up and through here. So I'm going to cover some of those marks up and kind of make it look like he's stuck in the snow. Let's have a little more of a hill in the background. So what I'm doing now is kind of constructing the background. All right, so I could maybe think about putting some trees. That's it. There's one more hillside that's a little bit steeper in the background that comes across here. And I'm hardly touching the background at all. So I'm putting a very light amount of white down because I want that to stay in the background. Or we can kind of move him for a minute. Okay, now for the trees, I find that if you just kind of make like a little, let's zoom in on that one. Maybe this will show a little better. Okay, so what I do is just kind of think about, you got kind of a spindly part and then just make a couple little shapes across that way and across that way. A lot of times if you're in an area that has a lot of snow, it's mainly these kind of white snowy puffs that show up the most. And then maybe make this next one a little bit lighter so it starts fading in the background a little bit. And let's get one of our smaller ones out. That could be smaller little markers in here. So the farther in the distance, the smaller they're going to be. So I'm going to try to fill some of the spaces with, littler trees so it looks like they're farther away. And then let's put one more here. If it's brighter white and if it's a little bit bigger, then it's going to stand out. Now, again, I can do the same thing. I can kind of come back, and in some places I can put some brighter bits so it looks more like it's the snow that is in the front, and the rest of it kind of recedes back. And then I'll come back and think, okay, we can really start putting the brighter highlights in now. Smooth that out a little bit. Okay. All right, let's put our heart where it belongs. Make sure your heart's in a good place. Okay, so he's going to go there. So what I'm going to do is take some of my paste or maybe my double stick tape. And I'm going to paste him down here. I normally let that dry plenty of time, but since we're kind of rushing around here. So now I'm going to paste one end. I have paste the other end. I'm going to lift him up. And the farther in this, let's zoom out here for a minute. The farther in this way, the higher it is. It's kind of like making this wedge. So that looks about right. So that's about a good inch. And so that when you close the card, it's going to compress down and then it's going to pop up when it comes back. So now we're starting to have the thing look like something. All right. Let me wipe my finger off here. All right, now I can take a white pencil, and if I want to do a little more kind of smoothing, I can come in with a white pencil over here. Then maybe take a slightly darker implement and put a little shadow down here. Make that a little more shadowed under the hat. A little shadow under the nose. And so it's starting to kind of develop this feeling that, this is kind of the light's coming here. It's really bright, but then, in through here, it's a deeper shadow. Can, kind of put a little bit of a shadow in there. And I could continue working on this until, I get it exactly the way I want it to be. But I don't want to take all our time kind of doing fussy details at this point when there's some more stuff I'd like to do here. Okay, now for our main character, he's kind of popping out here. And what I wanted to do now is maybe give him some arms. So I'm going to draw some mittens. Something as simple as that, and I'm going to cut those out. Again, with scissors, or sometimes it's a little bit faster to use a utility knife, which is what I'm trying to do, is go a little bit faster just because we've got limited time. Okay, so now what I'm envisioning is having these arms. We paste it behind like that, and then bend them in a couple places. So now I've got an arm that is going to be coming in front. I'll put it down a little bit farther here. Let's put it about there. And that, again, it's like one of those things that if I just leave it then when the card closes, it'll spring back up when I'm done. So that looks like that's going to work. So, but before I do that, I'm going to give the mittens a little detail. Okay, so I'll kind of make a little shadow around the thumbs. Kind of make these look a little more dimensional. A little shadow for part of the there. And I'll have a nice little trim. So then I'll be able to paste that down and then just kind of put it over and then maybe slightly fix it like that. Okay, so we got one arm coming out like that. Let me paste that down so it kind of stays more or less where it belongs. Okay. I can tell you, I look at it on my screen, it doesn't show up quite as much because of lack of contrast there, but so you can wave to you. And then I'll cut another, draw another and cut another one out. Here. So I'll do another little, I make the arms fairly long because I can always tuck them way underneath. Okay, and again, I'm going to put a little shading on them. So they look a little more mitten-like. Okay, and so this one, a little bit more of a field of view there, about like that. Okay, so I'm going to paste that one down. Okay. Let's see if I can get it centered here. All right, so now I've got these, see, he's waving at you. Hello. So now if I want to, I could take a white piece and I'll kind of approximate, make a little mark how far it has to be. Okay. And I can cut it out. And you could, use a straight edge. You could use a pair of scissors. You could actually tear it, to get a nice soft edge. I'll flip it over so you really can't see the. All right. Then I'm going to kind of bend it a little bit. So what I could do then is I'll put it between those two. Like this, I'll take my knife here and I can make a couple little slits right at the thumb and the paw of the mitten. And that'll help kind of hold it in place. Let's see if it's going to do it. Yep. Let me get some paste. Put some paste on the back of the mitten, slide my thing in there so it looks like he's holding a piece of paper. Okay, and I'll get a little more paste on this mitten. Then do like happy Valentines. Good. You could use stickers, you could decorate that, you could spend a little more time before you paste it on or whatever. So we'll get kind of an overall view of it. Okay. And so then when I close it, everything will compress. And then when I open it, it'll pop back up again. Right, so we got the snowman in the background. We've got our main character. We've got a little greeting. If you wanted to, I could maybe put a few more things in the background, some trees back here as well. Maybe a little skiing chalet or something like that, but whatever you'd like to do to kind of take care of it. And then you also have the top of the card too. You could write a message up there. You leave it the way it is. And then what I've done with the one
Franz,
example.
do you think you could show how to do the spring again, maybe?
Oh yeah, sure. It's really okay. So you just cut two. It doesn't have to be straight totally, but you want it about the same size. Okay, glue, piece together. You put the glue there, and then you put these two pieces so that they're perpendicular to each other. You line them up on the corner, okay? So you pretty much have a right angle. Okay, so that's the way it looks. So this one's on top, so you fold this one over. And kind of press it down, and then you just alternate it. And so your pieces are get shorter and shorter, but this is what creates the spring. And I've adapted it to this kind of pop-up technique because it really is nice the way that you can, it's a pretty simple way to get things to pop out. It has that springiness in just the energy of the way that you fold the paper. But originally, when I learned how to do this in first grade, you could also use these for arms and legs for your Valentine character. So if you want to, kind of think of your Valentine as being the body, then, and then you glue those as well. You'd finished folding them over. But then you can kind of see where you have, it's almost like an accordion. So when the card's open, it's extended, but then when you close the card, it compresses and flattens, so that it flattens enough that you could get it in an envelope, and then as soon as you open it up, the thing pops out again. Or, as I mentioned, let's just very quickly, I'll put another quick Valentine out. So if this is our then if I wanted to give him arms, or her arms, him or her, it arms, then I just need to glue it on that side, and then I can put a mitten or a hand or something over here. So you'd have a couple of arms, you could have a couple of legs coming down, or in the case of what I've done here, on this one that's a little bit more complete and a little more finished, I have it right there. So that's what kind of gives it a little bit of a lift, but then when it closes, let's see if I can do this if I get my arm in the way. Okay, then it goes flat. And so then when you open it up, it pops out. And then the same thing with the arms. There's enough kind of paper elasticity or energy in the fold that when it's in the envelope, it compresses a little bit. But then, there's enough tension that as soon as you take it out of the envelope, that it's going to pop up. And for this one too, I made it instead of a card that would fold together, I kind of I reversed the way that it is so that I can actually kind of stand it up. So maybe what I'll do is switch over to the regular camera. And so, it can stand up and it looks like that. So, kind of in creating this, like I even, let's see, there we go. Yeah. Okay. And so I also, maybe as a detail, I don't know if we can get it better with this one, but you can see up here, I did a little drawing of a Yeti. And then, he's talking about Valentine's Day up there. And then I did a penguin. This actually is a card that I decided I'd send to my daughter. And she has likes gorillas a lot. So the Yeti is saying, "I'm so lonely. I wish I could find the gorilla of my dreams." So, but when I send it to her, I will send it to her this way in an envelope, and then she can open it up and either look at it as a card, or she could, flip it around and have it that way. Yeah. So anyhow, this is kind of, it seems like the detail is a little bit better with the front on rather than the overhead. I was hoping that we could get more detail with an overhead camera, but you can kind of see a little bit more about the detail that I was developing that probably didn't show up so much on the overhead camera. And I think this way too, you get a better idea of it. Actually looks very dimensional, like the snowman's in the background, the trees are really in the background. Then you have this goofy Valentine personage holding out a little card saying Happy Valentine's Day. So and you don't have to do the pop-up things. You could keep them flat, you could collage them together, but I thought, kind of using a red ground and then building it up and getting all those tones by using the white marker and then just build it up and build it up. It kind of gives it a nice glow and an overall continuity to the redness of it. It really makes the Valentine pop out. And, since I always think of reds and pinks as being for Valentine's, appropriate to Valentine's Day, then, I kind of think that this is a kind of an interesting way to develop things. So we still, got the orange nose on the snowman and some blue and stuff, but it's primarily kind of those Valentine colors, yet we were able to kind of get a nice feeling for a scene that we created out of our imagination. So, as I develop these things, I think, yeah, I'd like to put a hill right there, and let's put some trees, and then kind of imagine what it'd be like to be out in the winter, kind of walking around, and then we've got our main character all nice and cheery and wishing everybody a happy Valentine's Day. So does anybody have any questions? Or the technology is pretty simple. That spring, you'll find all sorts of uses for it. But in this case, I kind of like the idea that, I guess maybe you can kind of see it from that view as well, how, it kind of slopes forward so that when you open it up, it kind of brings it out a little bit, but it isn't overly complicated making it work. And it's very effective. It just kind of gives it a nice kind of three-dimensional quality to it. And then you also get some of the shadows And just that extra dimension that you get with it kind of popping off like that is just like a lot of fun. Does anybody have any questions? In fact, I kind of like it when I twist it. It really kind of increases that, so you can play with it too. You can do a little video. You can do a little video. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, so it just, oh, look at, yeah, people are holding them up and they're looking great. Good. Yeah, and this is the way that I did it, and it's just like you could use any of the techniques I demonstrated, come up with your own personal. In fact, I would be a lot happier if you all found your own personal use for the techniques. But the main thing to do is, give into your creativity and develop your own world and figure out what your images should look like. But these are techniques that will help you discover things that are really a lot of fun, and you can use them to kind of express yourself. So if there are no more questions, I hope you all have a wonderful Valentine's Day and you stay warm and healthy and have lots of fun. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of examples of what people have done, and well, they look great. It's just a lot of fun. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Franz. Thanks, everyone, for being with us tonight. Have a great weekend. Have a very happy Valentine's Day.
Bye-bye.